Hello. So this week we're talking about when to protect older adults or when to interfere, or should older adults be protected from their own choices. And one of the tasks that you have this week is to look at Uncle Bert and some of the choices that he's been making. And it's illustrated in your text, and to respond to some of the situations that he's put himself in, and to make some decisions about what you might do if you were in this case. But this is particularly important for those of us who are interested in aging when we think about the idea that a lot of folks try to make decisions for older adults because they see things not going the way they want them to, or the potential danger or risk, harm for an older adult. But also there's a term called paternalism, which is basically imposing your own will because you disagree with someone. So we have to balance all of those things when we're thinking about navigating relationships with older adults, and if there is actual and true risk, and weighing that along with their autonomy or right to make their own decisions and have their own will. And in that balance, being mindful of that third prong, which is paternalism. Am I just disagreeing and not wanting them to do this? Or is this an actual risk and they cannot make this decision soundly? Which is a difficult thing to do for a lot of people, because a lot of people don't tease out their paternalistic motivations and this idea that an older adult can't make the decision. So really, we talk about, should we allow adults to make their choices? We're balancing these three issues: the individual's autonomy, the potential for this to have risk or harm for that person, and our own, if we're the ones making the decision, stepping in to make the decision for them, our own paternalistic motivations. Okay. All right, so I mentioned this, but the balance here in a lot of these decisions that we're talking about, whether it's elder abuse, neglect, finances, making your own medical decisions and healthcare decisions, making your own decisions about sexual relationships, all of these things are are in question when we become older and people start to think, well, maybe they aren't exercising the best judgment, maybe they aren't making the right decision, or in reality, potentially they aren't making the decision I want them to. So when we think about this from a provider perspective, or someone who's helping an older adult as a paid professional or professional, we think about their balancing autonomy and risk. So I put this in the case of my own research, sexuality, because a lot of times that has a high likelihood for paternalism to leak in, right? The I know better, I don't want you to do this, I disagree with you, therefore I think you can't make the right decision. And in reality, we need to step back from that and weigh these two factors more heavily. Very much so, this pie right here in the blue, autonomy of the older adult, gets lost and shrunk, particularly when we're talking about living situations, going into assisted care, going into a family member's home. A lot of times your rights and your autonomy start to shrink, unfortunately. And we start to overvalue this red part, and that doesn't to say that there isn't true risk in a lot of these situations, right? If there wasn't, we wouldn't have things like adult protective services. But there is a legitimate risk. It's just that we tend to overvalue the red piece and undervalue the blue piece in this. When we're thinking about, should an older adult be allowed to make these choices or supported in these choices versus maybe steering them in another direction or making a decision for them. Whenever we're thinking about restricting the autonomy of an older adult, this is very important too, is we're always hoping for the least restrictive alternative. So the book mentioned this, and this is particularly in reading 28. The authors talk a lot about these concrete issues, and it's a great one to read if you're going to focus in on one, about seeking the least restrictive alternative. Just because we're maybe shrinking this blue part of autonomy a little bit doesn't mean that we have to make it go away completely or that we cut it in half. We're always looking to make the smallest cut on autonomy that we can while also minimizing risk. That least restrictive alternative, whatever it is, we didn't put them in restraints, we didn't give them antipsychotic meds. If you're in a nursing home, we simply behaviorally redirected, provided another activity for them to do, the behaviors went away. That's sort of the least restrictive alternative. Most restrictive alternative being things like, when we're talking about shrinking autonomy, appointing a guardian, taking away decision-making rights, potentially being in restraints, feeding tubes, all of those kinds of things are more on the most restrictive end. Okay. So paternalism versus true risk. And this is a very important distinction, as I mentioned, because a lot of us go around and think that in our paternalism masks as true risk, right? The I disagree with you, I know better than you, isn't what we perceive it as. We perceive it as you aren't able to make this decision because you're not making the one that I would make. So you need to choose our way, as you can see in this here. Our way, our way, our way, our way. Okay, which one's your choice? That's a paternalistic point of view. So the questions become things like, when is this paternalism? Am I really just not allowing Uncle Bert to make bad decisions because I don't agree with him? Or is there true risk and elevated risk that needs to be mitigated? And I liked the way someone put it to me once, I think I read it somewhere, that shouldn't adults at any age be allowed, or people at any age be allowed, the same leisure to make bad choices? And just because we're older or we're younger doesn't mean we don't get the right to have bad judgment, right? So we have bad judgment across our lifespan. So if you're sitting there thinking, when's the last time I exercised bad judgment? For me, it's usually every night when I eat dinner and I choose to eat things that I shouldn't. But in that respect, we were all adolescents, teenagers, we're 20-somethings, and now in 30s and 40s, we make bad decisions all the time. That doesn't mean we get our decision-making rights taken away. It just means that we made poor decisions. So shouldn't older adults get the same freedom to make bad choices? And that, again, is where that balance comes in, right? So how much risk is okay to save the autonomy and not be paternalistic? When is it a real risk is the key thing. When is there a real risk of their inability to make these decisions? And how do we factor in the older adults' quality of life and their wishes, right? So again, with a least restrictive alternative, if we are going to shrink that autonomy pie a little bit, how can we make sure that it's as much in line with the wishes and the intent and the quality of life preservation for that individual? Okay, so as I mentioned, when is it a real risk of inability to make decisions? So when we think about when do we need to protect someone from themselves or the decisions they're making, this all really hinges on determining if they have the capacity to make decisions or not. And this is done in a number of different ways. And if you've been in the nursing home setting, you've seen it probably done, unfortunately, poorly. But usually we have some kind of markers of whether or not a person is able to make their own decisions. And oftentimes when we're talking about older adults in a long-term care setting, it's medical decisions that we're restricting, although in reality we restrict them in every decision because we think they can't make any. Let me tell you that it is not a dementia diagnosis. Just because you have a diagnosis of dementia does not mean that you have lost your capacity to make any and all decisions. In fact, you can make many decisions into even later stages of dementia, like what you want to eat, if you want to bathe or not, and a lot of those. And certainly when you're in early stages of dementia, you have a lot of your executive functioning and decision-making ability available to you. You may not be able to do complex things like make the decision to drive, make the decision whether or not you need life-saving surgery, but hopefully there are things in place to show what your wishes would have been. So someone who does have capacity to make decisions for you can do that. Anyway, so back to this. There are state laws that define what capacity is, and usually there's some kind of understanding of the situation, the ability to rationalize about the situation, and a sense of a voluntary decision being made when you're talking about if you have capacity. In the law, you're presumed to have capacity unless proven otherwise, right? So you have it as an adult, or an older adult in this case, unless they can prove that you don't. So it's not the reverse, which is often true in the way that we comport ourselves in daily life. There's also such things as supportive decision making. So if you don't have the capacity to make very complex decisions, you may have capacity to make others, or you may be able to make them if you have more support or scaffolding around you. And we want to always, if we are, again, restricting the autonomy and making decisions for someone, we always want to do it in their best interest. So what's in the best interest of this older adult? What's the least restrictive option? And what would they wish in this case? Okay. Let's look at a specific example of situations where you might need to protect. And this is when we see an older adult as being abused or neglected. So we know that there are about, I want to say 7 to 10, it says 7 to 10% of older adults that report abuse experiences. However, we know that this is underreported. So this is likely higher, and we don't know how much higher, but higher than this. We know that people with dementia are at higher risk, probably because some of them have lost their sort of abilities to rationalize and problem solve and have judgment and decision making, but not always. They are vulnerable individuals. We look over here, the majority of victims are 80 plus, so that oldest old group, the majority of our victims are in. We see them when we look at the perpetrators to the victims, we see a lot more, like a vast majority, 47%, it's an adult child of that person who is the perpetrator of domestic abuse. And you see that all the other kinds, spouses, next biggest chunk at 20%, but a lot of friends, neighbors, providers. You may have thought provider here, right? Someone who comes in, a home health aide, something like that. However, our adult children are the biggest perpetrators here. When we think about self-neglect or the inability to take care of yourself, it's more common among female older adults. According to the stats, that 65% of the older adults who are found to be self-neglectful are women. However, that could be also a reporting issue because we tend to see older women as more vulnerable than older men, and it might be caught more. Older men who are living alone may not, be maybe more independent, maybe left alone, just as a sort of masculinity, kind of old school idea. But we're not sure that that's actually true with a capital T, that women are more likely to be self-neglectful. They're just more likely to get reported. And some of the research has found that if we do provide caregivers, particularly children, with interventions to help them deal with their own stress and their own situations, that we can prevent potential neglect. Okay, so that's an example. So if we were going to assess self-neglect, and this isn't in a legal sense, right? So I should go back and clarify here. There are two sort of different types of determinations of capacity. So what you see when a medical director gives or a physician or nurse gives someone in a nursing home a cognitive screener and says, well, they're not able to make their own decisions anymore, that's a clinical determination. That isn't a legal determination yet. That's made within the courts. But when we're assessing these capacities, usually in a clinical determination, it's done by a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a physician, something like that. And we're pretty poor at doing that, I will add. Most of the capacities that we have, we're really poor at assessing them because we use these really rough screening tools that aren't meant to be diagnostic. They're meant to screen and then follow up and do a more comprehensive assessment. So, when we are assessing things such as self-neglect, we need to use the best possible tools available that are specific to that capacity domain, and that provide us with a wealth of information to be able to make this decision. So in the area of self-neglect, we do have an identified tool, the independent living scales, which is an interesting little instrument here. You can do cognitive tests with this, as well as adding in the independent living scales and your observations and the history of the person. The independent living scales do things like give a person an envelope and say, if you found this on the street, what would you do with it? What if there was a fire in your home? Given the things on this desk, how would you proceed? So there's a telephone on there, there's a phone book and things that they would need in order to maybe call somebody or call the fire department. So they give them little tasks, practical tasks, to see if they would choose a safe option. So it's just, you can see that it at face value looks very valid, because those are the kinds of things you have to do to live at home on your own. So they're making sure that they have these abilities still, or if they don't, what they are, and if we can support the least restrictive alternative, maybe they just need some more support in the home. Okay. And we also need to keep our paternalism intact here, right? So be as objective as we can about what risk is there, support as much autonomy as possible. And if it's truly just a physical problem, like I broke my wrist and I can no longer brush my teeth or get in the shower or toilet myself, then we need to make sure that we're thinking this isn't a cognitive issue, separate those out and make sure that it's not just I physically need to rehabilitate to take care of myself, or I physically need help, not I cognitively can't make these decisions. Okay, another example from my research about when to protect or when to allow adults, to have their own decisions or continue to, is in sexuality. So for those of you who have taken my class before or know the Center on Aging, we have a couple of people who work in this area, myself and Dr. Dole, who's been working in this for a long time. We're talking about the ability of an older adult to make their own decisions about their intimate relationships. And when this, again, becomes the most threatened is in an institutional living situation. So we have to be mindful, and this was in the Connolly reading that you were assigned, is to think about, is this really an issue with an older adult having, the inability to make this decision? There's clearly too much risk. We need to restrict that autonomy more. Or is this, and is there a possibility of abuse and coercion? Or is this I'm uncomfortable with this, I don't want this to happen, particularly as an adult child, and I'm stopping it, right? So we have to ride that line very, be very clear about that line in between paternalism here and actual inability to make decisions. But there are, of course, many situations where an older adult shouldn't maybe be the most risky in sexual behaviors, like perhaps sexual intercourse is outside their physical or cognitive capabilities to handle, but they're less the least restrictive alternative would be more intimate behaviors, holding hands or kissing or things that have less risk. Anyway, I wanted to show you the legal determination. So again, in the courts, your ability to make your own sexual decisions is defined in the majority of states with three major ways. As I said before, the understanding or the knowledge of the facts of the situation. What is sex? What behaviors am I trying to do? Do I understand some of the mechanics or implications of them? Am I able to kind of reason through the risks and the benefits of engaging in this? And am I giving my voluntary assent or consent to do this? Am I showing happiness and positive behaviors if I'm engaging in this? If it's taken away, are there more negative or depressive type behaviors? Or if it's taken away and I'm no longer able to do this, I improve. And that would be a sense of the non-assent, because they're showing you that this is a disruptive experience for them. So there are some other practical and ethical considerations that we look at on the clinical side as well as just those three broad legal terms. Is, it's not a yes or no, you always have it, you don't always have it, every situation you do or don't. It's not dichotomous, and it's not global, right? So if you can't make decisions about, to have a surgery, that doesn't mean you can't make decisions about sex. It always depends. It's a situation-specific issue, and it needs to be dealt with as such. Also, we want to look at this as and these capacities really in general as more of a harm reduction approach. So if you're familiar with the substance abuse world, the harm reduction approach is you don't have to be abstinent or abstain from alcohol, but we do have to reduce the amount of harm in it. So having a drink here or there and supporting you around that, fine. Same in this. If we're looking at sex, if we're looking at living alone, we want to support you in those situations as much as possible and allow you a little bit, the least restrictive alternative, but we aren't going to make you move out completely or stop doing anything intimate. Also, we want to look at voluntariness as more of a volition. If you can't verbally say, yes, I want to do X, Y, or Z with person X because of this, do your behaviors, the observables that you're showing, able to tell us that your assent is there? If you can't consent verbally, do your nonverbal behaviors show us that this is something that you want, which would be more of a volition type of thing. So this is the more considerations in this area of sexual consent. And if you're interested in it more, I have 1,000,005 readings, of course. It's my area, but feel free to contact me. We also have a couple of ways to assess sexual consent capacity that aren't great and aren't widely accepted, but we do look at a couple of these things, like, are you aware, is the person or older adult aware of the relationship they're in? Do they even understand they're in a relationship? Are they able to avoid being exploited by the other person or persons or abused? Are they aware of the risks that come along with being in this intimate contact? And then there's a lot of other things that need to be along with this, need to be asked. All right. So when we come to the conclusion that yes, in fact, this is a question of this person's ability, this older adult's ability to make this choice or not. They may be incapable. They're likely incapable. There are some ways that we can protect against or in these situations. And a couple of the main ways are legal. So those are the top two: guardianship and a durable power of attorney. You may have heard of these before in your different classes or your different experiences. But guardianship, what that is it's a legal procedure. So someone is determined to be unable to make their decision, an older adult, maybe Uncle Bert. You can't be in that relationship. You're being exploited by this woman and her brother for money and otherwise. So they're legally determined to not be able to make these decisions in a certain area. It could be medical decisions, living alone, finances, but it should be a specific area, not everything. Or they're not be able to control their own estate or assets anymore. And then the court appoints a guardian or a person who's identified as having the best interest of the older adult and it might be that person was their durable power of attorney, whatever that might be. So the guardian then takes over those decisions for them. And again, when we look at guardianship, there's major room for exploitation in a lot of guardianship laws and situations in states. There's a lack of oversight of guardians in a lot of ways. So after the initial determination is made, who's following up on this to make sure that the older adult's interests are taken into account, that there isn't any exploitation of funds or other things, resources for the older adult. The rights of the older adult in these proceedings, a lot of times the vulnerable party isn't that well represented, and that can be the case here. And we have to watch out for paternalism in this as well, right? So, it's not older adults understand when their rights are being taken away, and it's not a dignified experience. It's not an experience that instills dignity. And you can see here from this woman who is only 62 years old, and she was, her son was appointed guardian of her, and we don't know in what capacity, but it was a really shaming experience or humiliating experience for her. We want to, again, make sure that these experiences are appropriate, that they really can make their decisions, that they're the least restrictive alternatives, and that the guardians are the appropriate person. The other legal sort of document that you can put in place if you want to protect yourself in the future from decisions for when you can't make decisions and you want someone who will do this right for you, is a durable power of attorney. This is a legal document that gives you the right or gives you the power to choose someone to act in your place if and when you're not able to do so. So if you ever become mentally incapacitated, temporarily or permanently, you are given your power of attorney to this person to then make medical decisions for you, make financial decisions for you. And again, it's a limited scope, so you get to decide what kind of decisions what person makes. You could have a durable power of attorney for healthcare, a durable power of attorney for finances. They can be the same with different people. So this is a legal document. We also have some social services that help when older adults need to be protected from maybe not being able to make the best decisions, right? Or not being able to make decisions for themselves. And one of those is the Adult Protective Services, and this was also in your book. So Adult Protective Services is a social agency, a social service program that was created by the government in order to adjudicate at a state level, abuse and neglect for vulnerable persons. And Adult Protective Services covers older adults. It covers adults who are also vulnerable, maybe those who have Down syndrome or something like that. So basically what happens is people like me who are providers, either psychologists, teachers sometimes, certainly a lot of people who work within nursing homes, who are healthcare providers of any sort, are mandatory reporters, right? So they're obligated by their profession, if they see abuse and neglect of an older adult or an adult, to report that. Confidentially, perhaps, it's an option, to Adult Protective Services. So you're obligated if you've identified that they're in a current situation where they're being exploited or abused, to make a report to Adult Protective Services, and then Adult Protective Services follows up, makes a report, and may intervene. They may, go to the older adult's house. They may call in the police or involve the courts if it's needed. However, it does involve some cooperation on the side of the older adult or the older adult's family, because they can refuse, of course, to comply with Adult Protective Services. So it might then become this crazy cycle of then they're reported again, and Adult Protective Services tries to get in touch with them, and they refuse it again, and are reported again. And it can be a very frustrating situation, but these are the things that we have in place. The other thing that doesn't necessarily, it helps ahead of time when we're thinking about, when do we need to help older adults and start making some decisions for them, is in the end of life, if you're making decisions, which we'll talk about next in the next chapters, is having an advance directive or a living will, something that states your own wishes. This is what I would want if I'm unable to be able to make these decisions for myself. I don't want that. I do want this. And if, in fact, you're incapacitated at some point before you get to those things, then we look back to advance directives, look back to living wills and say, well, they didn't want a feeding tube. They didn't want, life-sustaining procedures, that kind of thing. So that can also help to protect yourself